Welcome to Swiss Holistic Institute, inviting you to this video podcast series on spiritual elderhood with Bob Weathers and Thomas Rüedi. Today's issue is shadow work. It's good to see you, Bob, again to another session to exchange what elders, people getting into, consciously into an elderhood are talking about, what issues are important to talk about, to think about, to meditate about. And one of these big issues, we both have a lot of experience, I guess, is shadow work, and I think it's a good picture to, if somebody is walking in the evening towards a light, you don't see your shadow, that is walking behind you,
It's a good image.
And so most of us, if we don't really consciously get in touch with this structure or this kind of view, it's hard to see because you don't see, And what I personally find is very important to see is there are individual shadow aspects we all have, and there are some collective ones, and of course they mix, and in the end it's always a mixture of both. But it's good, I think it's good to have, when we exchange today, maybe also to have both inside of our talk, because yes, I mean, in these days, if you look out into the world, you can see, really lots of shadow, like collective shadow stuff popping up, especially into these war zones, and what we have in Europe at the moment is but I think anywhere. So if you look at ecological issues about colonialism or neo-colonialism stuff, going on still. So there's a lot of shadow to work on. So this is what I would like to put into our middle to start.
Yeah, it's a great start. Thank you, Tomas. Maybe I can respond, and then we can just dialogue together. I really like your introduction, including the metaphor of walking towards the light and not seeing your shadow. When you told me that, you reminded me of something that Carl Jung once said. He said, the larger one's persona, that would be the part of us that's facing the light, the longer the shadow.
Yeah.
Which means that it's an equal and opposite kind of proportion to how big we are in the world, especially to ourselves. I also like what one of his students, James Hillman, said. He said this about Freud and Jung. He said they called it unconscious because it is unconscious. It's out of awareness. It's oftentimes not accessible to us. I know that you and I are going to talk about this a lot more today, for sure. I also like how you situated it, because I feel exactly the same as you. You situated the shadow not only individually. My background is in clinical psychology, and so much of my work as a psychologist and now as a recovery coach is working on the individual level. But my own work over the years has been with a Jungian analyst who does kind of a figure ground reversal in virtually every session between the individual Bob Weathers and the collective in which I'm situated, whether it's nationally here for me in the United States or globally here on this planet. And I've really, really appreciated that. So I'd love to follow your laying that out in our conversation today to juxtapose. And I liked how you put it. These two, they interpenetrate each other, the individual and the collective. So I'm all for doing that. From a psychological perspective, and I'd love to hear your addition to this. One way, if people will sometimes ask me, what is the shadow? And I'll say, it's that within our souls, or sometimes within our nations or our entire planet. Yeah. It's that within our souls, which is at least partially, if not completely, out of awareness or unconscious. And so, how do we work on that? That's a big question. I'll ask one other question. This comes from Father Freud. He was Jung's mentor, and Jung was the heir apparent to that tradition, and they had a parting of the ways. But Jung picked this up from Freud as well, so you might as well say Freud and Jung. Is that Freud said that you can either deal with the unconscious coming through the front door, that is, to choose to deal with it, or it will come through the back door. And his term for that was the return of the repressed. That which we repress does not go away, it just finds another way to come out. So I'd far rather deal with it through the front door, thank you very much, than through the back door, though I've certainly had my opportunity to deal with both. So what we're talking about is an intention, a conscious wanting to meet the shadow and work with it. In fact, one of my favorite books is written by a local Jungian analyst just called Meeting the Shadow. So that's really what we're talking about today, as I understand it, Tomas.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, it's always very interesting, when you share something out of your long experience you bring with you. And I think when I go back to saying what is the elderhood part of working with the shadow, so I think it's good to realize maybe going into elderhood that we have already done some shadow work. And shadow work means there is, in all our biographies, there have been things that hurt us, that traumatized us, that that we don't understand, that our families bringing with us, that our nations bringing with us, with it. And so on the other hand, I think talking about a little bit the mystical part of it, saying, I would say, the closer we get to the light, the stronger, the bigger the shadow gets. So you cannot get too close to spiritual, let's say, kind of enlightenment states without having seen our shadows. And this is something I really brought up in my book, because for me, in certain wisdom traditions, there is not strong enough, focus on shadow. Or I think this is modern work. What we have in shadow work. This is integral. This is psychological work. This is what adds up to traditional spirituality to get a modern spirituality.
Yeah. Really agree with you. Some years ago, and you know of this, and it's since been published. Some years ago, I had the opportunity to go to Boulder, Colorado, for a conference, and it featured integral psychology. In fact, it was my first face-to-face meeting with Ken Wilber. And I sat at that conference. I don't know if I've ever told you this, Tomas. I sat at that conference next to a man from Nepal. He was a Tibetan Buddhist dressed in saffron robes, and he spoke very little English. I'm not even sure if he spoke any English. We sat next to each other. I sat next to him each time that we met. I really loved his energy, but and I'm not sure how he understood the conference except by his presence, but he was a big presence. At this conference, it was called the Fourth Turning of Buddhism, and you're familiar with it. Yeah. It was when Ken Wilber announced what came out as a book subsequently, was that with the first three turnings of Buddhism, and you're familiar with all three of them, what they didn't have access to was what you just said, which was modern psychology. And so Ken Wilber was proposing a fourth manifestation of Buddhism that would be thoroughly integrated with the modern developments, particularly within developmental psychology. And he went on then a couple of years later. I came back to, I think this one was in Denver. No, it might have been in Boulder too. And it was on Christianity. The very same thing could be said about any wisdom tradition, whether it be Buddhism, Christianity, or any, but the same presentation, except to a Christian audience, is that whether it's Christianity, Buddhism, or any other wisdom tradition, you can't indict them for what they didn't have access to. And that's really the last 150 to 200 years, I would say, post-Freud in terms of developmental psychology. And it makes possible then for us to have a technology and an understanding of the development of shadow that was not possible before. So there needs to be an update, and I couldn't agree with them more. And I think it's right at the heart of our conversation today. I know of your deep relationship to Tibetan Buddhism and what you bring by your own awareness. And I have a companion, lifelong, what James Hillman calls flirtation with Christianity. I have a lifelong relationship to Christianity where I really care about this issue in terms of not only my own healing, speaking of collective, but what can I bring to here in the United States? It's almost impossible not to be, we're culturally Christian, no matter what religious tradition or not you come from. I really care about bringing what we're talking about to collective conversations, including what we're doing right now. It will go out to people that will view this, that will hopefully be changed by it, and then pass that along. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. This is, this is really an interesting issue, and I think this is something that when I was working on my book about the 3 steps into oneness, there has been some issues like popping up. I couldn't walk by, talking about how we live in the relative world and how people, belonging to spiritual wisdom traditions, and this is also, high lamas or high, representatives of any kind, probably any kind of wisdom tradition, stumbling over their shadow. Sometimes, it somehow it takes you over. It's like you're driving on the highway, and sometimes there's no other possibility if you don't see it in your mirrors, if it pass by you, and you will have it in front of yourself, and that was one of these really shocking experiences I had. This is one of my my Tibetan Buddhist lamas and teachers like Sogyal Rinpoche. This is the one who wrote this famous book about Tibetan book of living and dying. And what I found is there is this, on the relative level, you could say, there is this similarity, there is this simultaneousness. On one hand, there is this incredible book I would recommend anybody still.
Me too. Absolutely.
And on the other hand, there is this person that has his shadow, you cannot see it any stronger or any more these kind of scandals, misusing people and hitting people, and that's I think this is a very strong issue, especially for elderhood, is really to get to know these shadows and somehow to embrace them too, and finally to recognize them if they show,
I have great respect for Sogyal Rinpoche. I studied under him when he came to Los Angeles all those years ago, and his book was a huge inspiration to me. So I in no way compare myself to his influence, but it wasn't long, within a few years after I met him, that I myself fell off the edge of a cliff into my own unresolved shadow material. Here's the irony, is that I had been working in therapy. I was a psychologist. I'd been working in therapy for years, but it still caught up with me. And your image of the rearview mirror, it's exactly what happened. I think I saw something coming, not really, and then all of a sudden it was in front of me. But I lost my career as a function of addiction and poor choices I made. And in these last dozen or so years, as you know, most of my work has been focusing on working with people who, like I, got caught up in one manifestation of the shadow, which is addictive behaviors. And that was certainly my case. So I think, if my life had gone differently, and if you'd told me about Sogyal Rinpoche or any of the other great masters who were overtaken, let's say, by their shadow, I don't know that I would have been judgmental. I've never been that judgmental by nature, but I can say now when I read, for example, in your book, I was very touched in your book, and I had been aware of his story, along with many others that have touched yours in my lives. After having my own firsthand experience face-to-face with the shadow and the loss that entailed, it involved just complete professional devastation for me, is that I not only feel no judgment towards him, but I feel absolutely kin to him. I feel absolutely, I don't have any client that I work with. Most of my clients are coming in, many of them with severe addiction, and they're in recovery from that. I don't have any client that I feel any difference from. There's no superiority. I feel absolutely, and I'll say this much as an elder, because I am definitely chronologically an elder now, but I think psychologically and spiritually, the process of my own devastation and then rising again from the ashes, which I would only pray for with every single individual that's been to this kind of direct confrontation with the shadow. It's made all the difference in my life. It's made all the difference. And so I feel a level of compassion. I'll just pick that as one example. And you know how this is in your own life. I feel a level of compassion, not only for myself, it took a long time, but for every single individual that suffers in darkness, that suffers being overtaken by that shadow. I feel a level of compassion that I wouldn't trade this for anything. And I think for me, sad to say, I think it required my own descent into the unconscious and then all the work that's happened. And it's only by virtue of friendships like ours and people that have supported me that I've even survived. It nearly killed me. And it does kill plenty of people. Plenty of people just die because of the shame, because of the because of the depth of the loss, the grief. And so I'm really grateful for that. And so when we talk about shadow, even though you and I have books on our shelves, I know in your own book, in fact, before we met today for this, you shared with me something I feel so strongly about, Tomas, is that this isn't about book learning. This isn't about theories at all. It's born out of our own experience. I know for you it is, you know for me it is. And it's out of that place that I think that we can actually assume the mantle of being spiritual elders, because it's not theory anymore. It's absolutely our lives as we've lived them.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. This is really touching to hear your story that brought you in such at such a different level of being, as I understood, as I feel, as I can listen. And it was, even though it was really, hitting hard, it's, what was unveiled, is something so precious,
Thank you.
So I think that's what I what I wanted to really bring into my book, to say polarity is something normal. Polarity on the relative level of what I see, the horizontal dimension, living in this world is something completely normal, and everybody that is incarnated here or lives on this planet Earth is in this polarity. So it's no way to somehow escape of it. I think the path is to experience both, and to work with it both, and not because we are pretending to be so spiritual is the solution, but it is to be both, to be a normal living being, not having all the same problems, whatever. So that's one of my strongest motivations to bring it into this book, saying we have to focus more, being able to get into deeper spirituality, at what I say, to meet the absolute. We have to do our homework first. We cannot go at university not having been into high school, or in kindergarten. We have to build up this, and this is this developmental, psychology that is so important, coming from the integral view also.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier my own background in Christianity. As you know, I went to a Christian seminary to get my degrees in psychology and religious studies. And though I left conventional Christianity and conventional religious forms, I have a deep caring, as you know, for the heart of any of the wisdom traditions, particularly Christianity and Buddhism. And I don't know how this shows up in Buddhism, but I can give an example of how it shows up in Christianity. Is that there are scriptures, for example, in the Christian New Testament, that use the word perfect, that the word that's translated from ancient Greek is perfect. Jesus says, "Be perfect as I am perfect." And I grew up in this religion that I think took that quite literally and really misunderstood it radically. The ancient Greek word for perfect is that we translate as perfect is teleos, and teleos doesn't connote, in the ancient language, in the original Greek, it doesn't connote what we think of as being without fault or without blemish. It doesn't connote that at all. It connotes a sense of completion, or wholeness. And it's very much what you're saying, like to hold both sides or both polarities. That's exactly what that word means. And so it's unfortunate and more than a little bit ironic that the inheritance, I feel like, at least in my own experience, I can only speak of American Christianity and my bandwidth of it, which was fairly lengthy and fairly broad, is it's very much identified with one end of the polarity. So it misses the entire rest of the spectrum. And it's not even the intention of the scriptures. I quite well imagine with whoever the historical Jesus was, just as exactly with whoever the historical Buddha was, is that when they spoke these things, they spoke it from a place of what you're talking about, which is embracing the entire spectrum. And then, of course, how it gets translated for us mere mortals, at least here in the United States, is like one end of it. And so I feel like it's almost like the language, and your book does such a wonderful job of this, Tomas. The language needs to be reinvented so that we can approach these really important, depthful insights with enough depth to be able to contain all that they have, not just one part of what they have. So I'm all for re-envisioning Christianity in the United States and doing what Ken Wilber was talking about is, for that matter, updating any of the wisdom traditions, be it Christianity, Buddhism, or any of the other ones that we value.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really interesting and really important that to have the Christian view within our talk also, because originally I'm Christian too, but somehow when I was brought up, there has been a deep hunger of spiritual experiences, and I couldn't get any food, any nutrition in the church where I went, because there has been so very deep questions inside me, and there were no really answers I could, and this is the point where I went on my path to see and to hear and to experience other wisdom traditions, and especially I got somehow hooked, or I got caught somehow by spirit, Tibetan Buddhism. That there is something really fascinating, but interestingly also, when I was, as you are doing too, as I know, as I was studying Sufism, especially the one, that is not, deliberately and strongly connected to traditional Islam, where there you can read the same thing. You can have these knowledge, these insights, and that's what I believe is in any wisdom tradition originally there, and that's something I'm really fascinated, and I try to bring some of it into my book too. You
do a wonderful job of that. Our talking across traditions, and even you're bringing in Sufism, brings to mind a story. My dearest long-term friend is Jim Finley. We met each other in graduate school over 40 years ago. And Jim's teacher at the monastery was Thomas Merton. And this is a Thomas Merton story. Thomas Merton was invited back to his alma mater, which was Columbia University in New York City. He was invited back to Columbia to meet D.T. Suzuki, right when Suzuki came from Japan to the United States. Suzuki was really the most significant figure by far in translating the Zen tradition into English. And so these two leaders in contemporary spirituality, they met there at Columbia. And the story goes like this, is that Suzuki asked Thomas Merton, what is it that you wish for? What is it that you aim for? What's your mission in life? And Merton's response was this. He was a lifelong Catholic monk. in a cloistered monastery. His response to Suzuki was, "My goal, Dr. Suzuki, is to become the best Buddhist I can possibly be." Which is always so striking to me, so beautiful to me. I've known Jim for all these decades, and Jim speaks primarily to Catholic audiences, owing to his own religious background. And yet in our conversations, Jim is equal parts Zen, certainly tremendous respect for Sufism. In fact, Jim gave me a book a couple of Christmases ago. It's Thomas Merton and Sufism. Merton had a love for Sufism. It doesn't really matter. Merton wrote a book on Taoism. He wrote a book on Zen masters. The language doesn't matter. If you get down to a deep enough place, they're all saying something similarly. In fact, I find it ironic. I did the same thing as you. I had to leave Christianity and I sought the depth. I liked how you put it. I was hungry for some nutrition and I couldn't find it within the conventional Christianity. So I left it for Buddhism. My doctoral dissertation at a Christian seminary was on Buddhist meditation. That was a trick to pull off. But what I discovered, and Jim has been such an example of this, is that if you go deep enough within any tradition, and what I discovered over time, including within the Christian tradition, which is more familiar to me, is that the truths we're talking about are there at the heart of it, including the embracing of polarity. If you read the Catholic mystics, Meister Eckhart, St. John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, the way that they talk about the dark night of the soul or the cloud of the unknowing, that means going into a place of embracing opposites. And they spoke of this hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So it's just there. It just never got picked up in the mainstream in Christianity, probably in any country, but I'll say for right now, I know for sure in the US, it never caught on. So that's what you and I are doing, is reviving some of these traditions in the contemporary world, whether it's Switzerland or the United States, where we live. That's my wish, is to reaffirm the truths at the depth of these traditions.
Yes, thank you. This is, I think this is something really touching. The deeper, we get into one of these traditions, especially meeting what I call in my book the absolute. If we do a lot of work on the relative, we will find what I believe, we will find relative truth and wisdom. So it's let's say, to live with Mother Nature in a role that is appropriate as a human being, is the outcome of relative wisdom. Not to destroy, being a part of it, finding our role, and then after having done this, it's so important then to meet the absolute. That is, in many traditions it is God or it's Allah, is a and in Buddhism I call it the absolute. It's the space. It's a knowing space. When we were talking last time about the knowing field.
Beautiful. I love that term. I do. Yeah.
The funny thing or the interesting thing about this, there's no difference. I think between the knowing field of like a deep or mystical view, combined with a lot of reflection and meditation, is in the end is what comes, out of the absolute. Absolute is, in Buddhism, there's a lot of talking about emptiness, So it's not empty at all. So you don't see anything. You don't, but it's possible to hear things, and it's possible to even see things, but they're quite different, So it's the deeper we get the more important is to know our shadows. And one issue I would like to bring up here now is what I really was struck about is, the role of colonialism, together with, with Christianity or Catholic Christianity, what happened there in these last 200-300 years, what happened there. This is a huge shadow still there, and trying to get awakened in neocolonialism. And something I really love to find when I was researching on this issue, especially in the internet, I was finding some universities in Northern American researching about decolonization, to get things from an indigenous tradition and get them back to the original, to take off all what has been put on or was all these traditions, especially the children, have been really badly mistreated and has been very badly socialized, couldn't talk their indigenous languages, couldn't express their culture. And this is something I'm really hurt, because this is something we have to really take care, and that's why I'm really fascinated about these also scientific approaches about the decolonization. I think this is such a beautiful other polarity that brings back some things to a certain wisdom.
I have a response that's very specific. Is one of the most meaningful books I read this last year was written by a Canadian lawyer. The title of the book is Return to the Teachings, which is it's a book about decolonialization. And he's an attorney that talks about returning to the Aboriginal teachings of the First Nation people in Canada. Mm. It has a specific application. As fate would have it, Tomas, I can't remember if I've told you this or not, I've been invited this October to speak at the first International Conference on Restorative Justice. They've actually selected me as the keynote speaker, which is a lot of responsibility. Wow. So I've got a lot of work to do. But the topic is going to be what this book is about, namely, I'll just give you a quick story. My father, as you know, was a psychiatrist. I grew up with my father working in the state hospitals here in the United States, specifically in California. And back in the 1960s, when I was still just an elementary school boy, there were changes in the politics, and they called it deinstitutionalization. They closed all the state hospitals. Well, my father no longer worked in the state hospitals. And so all the patients that my father would have treated medically were now released. Well, it doesn't take much imagination to see where that went. Everybody that my father saw soon enough ended up in prison. And my father shifted careers from working in state hospitals. He spent the last 30 years or so of his career working in the state prisons here in California. Okay. And he rose to the top in that field. That's what he did. But so I grew up with my dad telling me that, Bob, the people we used to treat, we now send to prison. 80%, it's actually 85% of those in prison in the United States are there because of drug-related offenses. They were either high when they committed a crime, they were selling, which is criminal, or they were using, which is criminal. So that's 85% of our population. They used to get treated, and now they're getting incarcerated. And so I grew up with this as my background. flash forward, here we are and talking about returning to the teachings, is that in the United States, we only use retributive justice, which is an eye for an eye. If you commit a crime, you go to jail. We don't have a vision of treatment. Well, if you go back to any of the indigenous populations, whether it's First Nation people in Canada or Native Americans or any other native tradition, Australia, Aborigines, New Zealand, they're very much familiar with another approach to justice. Now, you're familiar with it, but a lot of people aren't. And people in the judicial system in the US are almost completely ignorant of it, as are most psychologists. And it's referred to as restorative justice. The idea is that you commit a crime. We don't look the other way. You have to take responsibility as the one who committed the crime, but we restore you to relationship, including needing to make amends, needing to pay back whatever you did. It's a very different approach to looking at justice. It's very well developed in native traditions, almost completely invisible or non-existent in the US. Outside of countries in Europe, including Portugal, Scandinavia, and I'm looking at you, Switzerland, there's a very enlightened approach to dealing with drug abuse and treatment as opposed to incarceration in the countries I just named, and it's proven to be successful. For every dollar that's spent right now in the US on treatment of substance abuse addiction, you save $6 to $7 of what it costs to put somebody in jail. So it doesn't even make sense financially to do what we're doing. Forget about the morality of it. So back to this idea of looking at the collective shadow. What we've done in the US is we've colonized the US. We've completely repressed all influences from the native population there. We've exported them to reservations. In fact, many of them, they have the highest rate of addiction in the United States, are the people that we colonize. And we won't use their approach to justice, which is restorative justice. That's what my presentation is going to be on in October. And I care deeply about this. It's part of every time I get a chance to speak to any audience in the world of substance abuse treatment, and I speak several times a year to national audiences and so on, I bring some version of this message because it's completely alien to most people, including the mental health practitioners that I'm one of them, is what can we do to restore the wisdom of the indigenous practices? They knew this and it worked for them, and we've long since lost it. The war on drugs is manifestly unsuccessful. Can we stop that metaphor and try a different one? You know?
Yeah, thank you a lot to all of these insights you have. I mean, it's quite a tough issue, and it reminds me saying in my book, you know, if you want to see how wrong we treat Mother Earth, you have to look at the indigenous people around the world, how they have been treated and how they are still treated. Most of them still treated that way, you know. There has been some progress, and there has been, and I think one of the major sources of I say relative wisdom is the indigenous view, you know, living close, you know, to nature, living, you know, originally, I would say, you know, and that's why I started to have some regular, you know, some kind of lectures from a Navajo, how I say, elder, you could say. I mean, this is something we have been speaking about technology. I think this is something about technology I really love, and because you can really get these pearls, you know, out of the rubbish. You know, you can get them, you know, inside the world, you know, the www, there I find I get regularly some videos to see, and what I find there is they're talking about really deep understanding what I know coming from Tibetan Buddhism, that is, in the end is very some kind of indigenous too, because they have been, living in Himalayas, very close to nature, and so there might be this connection too, So this is something I'm really touched by,
I've always loved your connection to nature, and it shows up in your photography and in your music and our conversations, and it's rooted in many resources. Living in such a beautiful land like you do, and also being deeply connected to another mountainous tribe, let's say, of the Buddhists that live up in the Himalayas. As I was listening to you, it reminds me, if I've had two major influences on a personal level in my life, one of them I mentioned, it's Jim Finley. He's been a best friend for all these years. And the second individual is Don Sloggy. Don is a Jungian analyst, and I've worked with him for 4 decades. Don studied under Ed Edinger, and Ed Edinger studied under Carl Jung. So there's that tradition, but there's another tradition that's actually as meaningful to me, is that Don studied under John Neihart, and John Neihart studied under Black Elk. Black Elk, in fact, he wrote Black Elk Speaks, and that's Don's teacher. And so my work with Don all these years has been equal parts Carl Jung, who himself had a deep relationship to Mother Nature, and to Black Elk and the Native American tradition. I think that Don is, if there could be a melding of Native American and Jungian, Don represents that. And I've been very fortunate because he's a man of the earth. Jung had this term that he used, and it comes from the Latin, and I don't know what the translation would be in German. The English word is not a word that most people use. It's chthonic, 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 and it just means of the earth. And Don oftentimes will talk about this. He'll refer to me this way. He says, Bob, you're a chthonic sun, like being the son of the earth. Well, if I am, then Don is. It takes one to know one. So to be in therapy for all these years and really spiritual formation with both Don and Jim. I've got a book of Thomas Merton's photography right here on the shelf behind me. Thomas Merton was deeply, deeply related to Mother Nature, and he loved photographing natural scenes and then writing poetry about it. It very much informs who you and I are, and it definitely gets stronger for me the older I get. I have to say that every morning when I'm out for my morning swim out in nature, including this morning, I take in the sky and the trees and the hawks. It doesn't grow less for me, it grows stronger for me by the year. So I'm very happy for us to affirm Mother Nature right at the root of what we're talking about, including the indigenous traditions that know so much about this.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. And what I was remembered now is we both have been, on our way to find our path into elderhood. We both, I think, have been studying the book of Zalman Shachter-Shalomi about from aging to saging. And I think what I really love, because this is when he was writing it with his friend together, this is I think 10 to 15 years ago. But he's saying, what elders want, the role of elders is on one hand to get back the role elders had in indigenous traditions, as mentors, as sages, the ones if we get really into troubles, we go there. And the other one that he's saying is it's very important to, as an elder, to have a really strong connection to Mother Nature, to development, and to process going on to recover nature, or to I remember having one of these really I love this kind of this chapter in my book about rewilding Europe, saying that we, as soon as we have some knowledge that is scientific too, we can get things, we can give it back to Mother Nature, and it runs it on its own, as it has done, for so many years, and millions of years.
This is so rich. Tomas, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I wonder if we might even do a part 2 of it. We can think about this, but I mean, just this conversation about shadow, whether it's collective, as we've been speaking just now, or individual, I just feel like there's so much in it. And by definition, it doesn't get discussed enough because it's in the rearview mirror.
Yeah. Either it's you can see it in the mirror, or if you don't see it there, it has taken over you,
Yeah, that's well said. That's well said. I can definitely relate to that.
Yeah.
Well, Tomas, I've got to move over in just a moment. I have a meeting in a couple of minutes, and so I wonder if we could bookmark it right here, and when you edit it, we can decide how we want to. Maybe you'll have a conclusion that you offer. Does that sound okay with you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the beautiful thing about our conversations are, they can go on for hundreds of years, because there's nothing, there's just something, as we said last time, maybe something talking to itself, something that has found a form to show,
I like that image a lot. I like that a lot. That feels good. That feels
thank
good.
you. Thank you, Bob,
thank you. Thank you for organizing this. And you can think about even our next conversation in a few weeks if we want to revisit this. I feel like there's more, but I'm open to wherever we go.